welcome everyone to this seminar. We have a CIPS seminar today in partnership with S&P Global. This is going to be part one in a three-part series, so look out for links to the others as well. Today we'll be looking at why taking a data-driven approach, a proactive, predictive approach to risk, it just makes business sense, and how data can ultimately help businesses to manage risk. If you were expecting Emma Scott to be with you today, apologies for that. Emma's not able to join us, but I'm Kerry Jones, Editor of Supply Management, and we're joined by two fantastic industry experts. They will be able to share their insights and experiences as well over the next hour. Do make the best use of them and send us through plenty of questions in the Q&A function as we go through, and we will definitely come to those later on. So first up, who do we have with us? We have Penny Flint. Penny is partner at PwC. Hi, Penny. Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do?
Hi, great to be with you. My name's Penny, as you said, partner at PwC. I specialise in all things supply chain, third-party risk management, which I utterly love, because 20 years ago, the risks we were dealing with in this space were very different. 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and to the present day, and I know in 5 years' time they'll be very different. So I find it a fascinating area to work in, and I regularly take phone calls going, "You're going to do what with third parties? Okay, interested. Let me help." So great to be with you today, talking about something I'm really passionate about.
Wonderful, and thank you so much. I love the enthusiasm. That's a fantastic start. And then we also have Simon Chard. Simon's Managing Director of Global Business Development at KY3P. Hope I got that right there. Simon, could you say hello and tell us a bit about your role as well, please?
Hi, Kerry. Yeah, thank you for having me. So I am at KY3P, which is Know Your Third Party. It's a product from S&P Global Market Intelligence. We are focused on supporting everybody's supply chain risk management needs. We run a utility, we run an assessment service, and we're also supplying clients with data to help them manage supply chain risk. So that's what we do, and similarly enthusiastic about supply chain risk.
Fantastic. Well, that sets us up for a good discussion today. I hope everyone watching is just as enthusiastic. And like I said, please do send off any questions through the Q&A function. The seminar is being recorded. You'll be able to watch it on the CIPS YouTube channel later, but do take advantage of the live stream while you can. Yes, so let's kick off. Just a little bit of background. I'm going to set the scene here. So what we're talking about today. The business landscape is extremely volatile, and obviously we're all very aware of this global pandemic, that while the initial fever of that is died down, we're still dealing with the after effects. Plus that's closely followed by a war in Europe and the subsequent impact of that on trade and supply chain, and currently now the rising cost of living, and let's not forget of doing business as well. So all of this comes on top of normal risks that organizations are dealing with all the time. So I'd like to ask you both, first off, what are your experiences around how the risk landscape is changing, and some things that you've actually, some things that you've witnessed either within your organization or externally. Penny, if I can come to you first.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think my reflections are, in the 20 years I've worked in this trade, I've never faced such market uncertainty and so many unpredictable events that I haven't even thought may occur, right? Even like black swan events, a pandemic was one of those things that we spoke about in, business continuity planning with regards to third parties, but we never thought it would be crystallized. So, when I think of the risks associated with third parties, when I think about it under a procurement lens, as I say, I've just never faced so much uncertainty, so much unpredictability in the market. At the same time, we're putting a lot of pressure on procurement managers, on third party managers to be able to plan for uncertain events, to expect them to be able to look at different scenarios, test different scenarios, be able to preempt how they might deal with certain incidents, certain risks. but they don't potentially have the data, the underlying data, to be able to do that and to accurately, stress their third-party relationships or to run appropriate scenarios over that. So my reflections are, we need to get on top of the data really quickly so that we can, plan and preempt different scenarios, different stress, take preemptive action against what is a really uncertain market. Simon, I'm sure you've got some reflection as well, no doubt.
Yeah, and I think obviously we're seeing a synchronized slowdown from an economic perspective. One of the, obviously for many of us, probably the first, completely synchronized slowdown from a macroeconomic perspective. And then you've got the double whammy of energy and food price. And that is asynchronous, as in it's impacting, different countries around the world, different organizations that people on the webinar are dealing with very differently, depending on their sort of balance of trade on energy and food. And of course, we all know, as Penny says, of numerous black swan events when people used to sit 10 years ago only in risk workshops, finding it difficult to think of an example of a true black swan event, and we don't have that problem anymore. The other thing that our data is telling us, though, is that there is opportunity, and it's not. There are some tailwinds, particularly in Europe. Supply chain. The data tells us that supply chain bottlenecks are starting to ease, and also that there is a very significant backlog of work, in European factories, and order books are relatively full. And I think that actually makes it more difficult, because we've got this risk landscape that Penny describes well, but we've also got quite a lot of opportunity within that. So it's twice as much work effectively. Yes, we're in this slowdown, but there are really interesting pockets of opportunity so we've got to be agile to be able to access them. And then I think if you look at that from a risk perspective, again, I struggle to think of a time when we had both financial and non-financial risks that were so volatile at the same time. A cyber threat that has never waned since we first started talking about it 20 years ago, but with a new flavor of quite grave kind of financial risk and impact on business success. So yeah, a very, very busy time.
Yeah, I can imagine. Actually, but you make a good point there about some very, very different examples. Penny, do you have any examples of the types of risk that procurement teams are facing at the moment, or even types of things that you're actually planning for?
Yeah, no. So I mean, just to build on Simon's example, because I think it's a really good one. If you take cyber and financial, one of the areas we've been working with procurement teams and third parties is how one is a lead indicator for another. So, financial resilience is 100% a lead indicator for something will fail in your control environment. Why we see a linkage when we do a root cause analysis around an incident, that a firm has less cash and they cut down on controls. So how do you start bringing this data together to be more meaningful? So, if I can see that my third parties are suffering from financial resilience, how can I increase my oversight of those third parties, preempting that maybe something could happen in that control environment? May not happen, but increasing that level of risk. The same with the focus now on ESG, hugely important, from a societal perspective. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. But again, what we talk to procurement functions about is, are you being put on increased pressure to favour third parties that have a good ESG credentials in the market, but you're sacrificing, say, cyber credentials, or sacrificing, financial resilience? And we saw a lot of that with the rise of the fintech organisations 10 years ago. And I know Simon remembers that very well. We wanted to get into bed with these organizations that, were one man out of the garage. And so we sacrificed financial resilience. The sort of better organisation went into that with their eyes opened and looked to put different mitigations in place to handle that risk. And the ones which were a little less immature went into it and then had significant resilience issues on the back of it. So, you know, all these risks, you know, and this is where it gets really difficult to make meaningful, but you've got to have these conversions of risk domains, because when you look at them in isolation, that tells you something for sure. When you look at them together, that tells you something more, and potentially, you know, with a slightly different lens, a different outlook on the back of that.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think there's no one size fits all, like you're saying, it evolves and your risk management has to evolve with that. But Simon, so you did mention cyber, but are there any other examples of risk management that you're actually planning for at the moment?
Yeah, and I just wanted to pick up on a point before I answer that in relation to the financial risk, because again, for the first time in the economic cycle, we have a position where if one of those other risks impacts, you know, financial buffers were always the place of last resort, right? And most corporates had financial resources to cover some sort of impact from one of those other risk domains. And that's now not the case. So that's going to be an amplification effect. I think we've mentioned ESG. ESG is, you know, both a risk and an opportunity, but it also, I look at it in a similar way to cyber, that you've got a surface that you need to protect, right? And obviously in cyber, people will talk about kind of protecting the surface and the threat landscape around that. In physical supply chains and in many other non-physical supply chains, there are so many different places where you might have an ESG exposure, but obviously you may not know where it is. And I think also, you know, as pressure mounts, people will find themselves, you know, almost exposed where people have gone deliberately looking for ESG, you know, related issues to undermine organizations. From a cyber perspective, you know, just doesn't ever wane in terms of the increasing impact that you know, cyber risk has. The other risk domains that our clients are looking at, the data that we provide them with, are around location risk. We haven't talked about that, but really important, particularly as we start to think about extended supply chains out to fourth, fifth parties. And we've got an impact there from globalization versus localization. You know, we could fill a whole webinar with just one of these interesting data points about sourcing from, you know, moving from China to Philippines or wherever else, because people are effectively, you know, protecting national interests. And then you've got, I guess, the final risk domain that we focus on, and that again is really volatile, is beneficial ownership. You know, the ownership of the entities that you're working with. And we're starting to see understanding beneficial ownership of an organization, sanctions, and those other screenings, that kind of world, you know, get built into the third-party landscape, because the fact of the matter is, across all of these things, you've got to know who you're dealing with, and you've got to know how they are dealing with all of these risks.
Absolutely.
And Kerry, just to, I guess, sort of pull that together under a procurement lens, you know, even just hearing Simon speak then, you know, if you think about the depth, the breadth of the risk domains, and therefore the pressure, at the same time, you've got more third-party contracts being entered into than I've ever seen in a 20-year period, and the complexity of these arrangements being entered into, I think gives rise to, you know, a procurement risk in terms of, have they got the right resources, have they got the right capability. We were working with one organization recently that said end to end, they estimate it takes them 750 hours to complete all of the due diligence over a third party, which is a
for one third party.
one third party to do all of sort of downstream activities, anti-bribery, corruption, financial crime, cyber. So they were sort of, you know, trying to extrapolate that out as to what FTEs do they need to have. And it's a staggering number. But again, I was sort of working with them to say, well, let's all agree you need to gather data as part of the onboarding process. But what data on these risk domains do you need to gather at different points in the process? Is it that when you've just issued an RFP out to 3 providers, you need to do full due diligence over those 3 providers? How can you utilize a utility to support with that data gathering? How can you make it, you know, a quicker, a faster process? So yeah, just to reiterate, I think we all agree the risk domains are increasing, the breadth of the risk domains are increasing. But what does that mean to procurement at a time that third parties contracts are increasing, the complexity are increasing? I think that's a real risk, not to frighten potential audience members, but I do think that as a risk.
I'm sure there's probably a lot of similar sentiment going on. I'm sure there's even more things going on in the chat possibly. No, you raise a really good point, and that brings us quite neatly to the how. So then in that case, then what do? You know, there's such a variety of risk, and it's growing all the time. And the way we're doing business now, and the way procurement is working in so many more streams than it was before. So it's all ever extending. So then how can you building more operational resilience to deal with those requirements? Because, you know, we're in a changing landscape that is now, we have to accept, continually changing. That's, you know, that's how it is. So, you know, how can we, I guess we're calling them shock absorbers, you know, how can we build that in to reduce the level of volatility we're experiencing when inevitable disruptions do happen? Well, Simon, do you have any thoughts on that? Where would you start?
We had a live example, didn't we, of you know, just in time versus just in case, depending on how long you leave it before you join the start of a webinar, and how much stress that introduces into the system, depending on people's risk appetite. So it's quite a good example earlier. And yeah, obviously it's a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. Just in case instead of just in time. Fascinating to think how that impacts cost, because the reason that, you know, we all got used to just in time over probably 30 years is around cost. There's a comment in the chat about offshoring versus onshoring. So many different decisions to make to weigh up that balance between cost and resilience. And I think, you know, some of the consumer price inflation we're seeing now is people taking opportunity to be able to reset their pricing, because you know, things have been in some cases, you know, effectively too cheap, and we need to you know, we need to re-baseline. In my experience, nobody really likes mapping, you know, whether it's physical or virtual supply chains, or even end-to-end processes or customer outcomes, and that's problematic, because, you know, you need to understand the end-to-end delivery. You also need to be able to understand how you deliver that, you know, customer service or product, to be able to test it properly. And I think one of the things we hear constantly is that people want to be able to do more testing, and to be able to do that testing, you've got to know, you know, who are those relatively small suppliers that might be incredibly important at a real kind of a really pivotal part of the end-to-end delivery of a service that aren't apparent. You know, they don't come up on the, you know, top 10 biggest suppliers. They don't come up on the top 1,000 biggest suppliers, but actually they're supplying something, you know, that maybe only they can do. Or to Penny's example earlier, maybe they were onboarded at a time when everybody was also forcing, you know, innovation or supplier diversity. So testing, I think, is probably the number one for me in terms of being able to, you know, create that shock absorber, as you call it, and then to come up with the right scenarios to enable us to test. I actually think that's easier now because we've talked about it a little bit before. It used to be the case that you talk about a scenario and there's always somebody in the room who'd say, well, that's just ridiculous, you know, that will never happen. And I think risk professionals have been helped by the fact that we've lived through so many ridiculous situations, really, that actually I think it's easier then to say, you know, this is plausible and it is really severe, and of course we just don't know what the next one is. And I think the final piece I'd say is, you know, those who learn early to remove, you know, a lot of risk management is based on impact and probability, but to stop thinking so much around probability, to stop trying to spend so much time allocating a probability, but just to be thinking about the impact of something, I think was a real lesson, a lesson for me, certainly.
I do want to ask the same to Penny, but before that, I just have another question about, so how could you just explain a little bit more about the types of testing that you think that work especially well? Because I mean, obviously we've already got, say, 750 hours of due diligence going into suppliers. Do you have a recommended approach to the testing that works for you?
Yeah, and we may come on to it. I think it's related to what do you do pre-contract and what do you do post-contract. We were talking about that, and may come back to it. I think it's post-contract. I think there's the diligence that you need to do, but then I think it's, and the benefit isn't just for resilience, it isn't just for good third-party management. It's good for the entire business to be into and to kind of develop the, you know, the institutional muscle to be able to keep testing the way that they deliver, you know, like I say, products and services, and to keep exercising scenarios. And it's part of bringing what the business continuity profession has been building since its inception into the boardroom and into, you know, the COO and that role, and to be constantly challenging how we know that we can continue to deliver. So I think it's post contract, and I think it's about the whole organization, not just the supply chain. And it needs to become a way of working rather than a, you know, oh, you know, we've got to go do this big quarterly test that, you know, everybody hates. And everybody tries to find a way to either kind of remove themselves from or just make sure that they get through it without any problems.
Sure, completely understand on that one. And then Penny, how about at PwC? How are you building in more resilience operationally?
Yeah, I guess, and we've seen, I think financial services has also done a lot of work in this space, and then we've built on that because we've asked organizations to repivot. So originally we sort of looked at organizations as what I call functions. You've got procurement, third-party risk, you've got IT risk, you've got cybersecurity risk. Now we're looking at organizations under important business services, and I think the non-financial services industry has also looked at this around, you know, product development, and can we look through a sort of single glass of pane and understand, you know, look through a window and understand how that important business service is delivered, how that product is delivered, and all the dependencies that sit behind it. So third parties is a massive dependency that sits behind an important business service that is delivered into your clients, or sits behind a product that you develop that delivers, that, you know, that sits behind how that product is delivered, as is data, people, technology, etc., etc. So you've got to really look at it under that lens and say, well, if something happened with this particular third party, do I properly understand my exposure here from a resilience point of view? Whereas before we could say, well, on aggregate, I know that I have 10 different contracts with IBM, but it might be that those contracts have been mapped through to the important business services that in actual fact that they're delivering through to your customers. And then again, this is where it comes through to your like testing, your scenario testing. Only when you've got good quality of data can you properly test. So one of the things I'm asked a lot about is, you know, exit planning. How much do I test my exit plans around how I can exit out of a third party? And I always sit there and go, well, what is it supporting? You know, what is, how quickly does that service need to be up and running? What's your threshold? What's your tolerance to that service being down? Supports me with understanding how quickly we need to be able to exit out of this third party, and how much we need to be able to test that from a substitutability point of view. And my thing, without again scaring people, is don't underestimate what a big exercise that is, because we're rethinking the whole organization in terms of exactly what Simon says around that mapping. You know, it's not just IT articulating the IT contracts that they've got to articulate the IT contracts that they've got and what business services they support through. So what tooling have you got in place? What utilities can you leverage? How can you bring all this data together to again be meaningful, rather than it all sits in silos, isolation, and individual functions?
I think that's a good point, because our supply chains at the moment have become so extended that we've actually become accustomed to quite a high degree of risk. And like, even though Simon was saying, you know, we've become accustomed to other things like speed and things being cheap, we're still we don't have a lot of direct involvement with some things necessarily, like say third-party risk. But what role do you think that supplier collaboration can play in that, and to properly monitor and then have more control over third-party risk? Penny.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, people ask me a lot. Probably the number one question, I'm sure Simon is the same, if I had £1 for every time I get asked this, is, you know, what do I have to do on subcontractors? How much do I need to do on my nth parties, my fourth, my fifth parties? How do I get access to that data? And I do sort of typically sit with people and sort of, you don't know who your third parties are and they're not in an inventory. Let's focus on that first. And increasingly people have understood their subcontractors by, you know, at a point of due diligence, at a point, you know, pre-sourcing. You've said, is there a subcontractor involved in this? What they've not been as strong at on an ongoing basis is tracking their exposure to that. And that's where I'm a big believer, that sort of collaboration with suppliers, collaboration through utility. Building on a point Simon said, you know, can you get a data feed that highlights ultimate beneficial ownership through to you, which gives you an indication that something has changed with your subcontractors? There's been a change event. There's other tools that, you know, you can utilize that track open data sources, and you can flag through again that there's been a change with your third parties, there's been a change with that underlying subcontractor base. So I think 100%, I think supplier collaboration through different utilities, through different data feeds is really important, because at a point in time you can ask a third party, and then I think it changes pretty quickly, and having real-time monitoring is really important. I can't emphasize enough that I truly believe change drives risk, drives the manifestation of incidents. So how can you know, change in a subcontractor is significant, for example. I'm sure Simon has some thoughts around supplier collaboration in this space.
Yeah, and on fourth parties, I think regulation will drive, you know, behaviours. And what we're starting to see, if you think just about one example around financial services regulation, is driving critical third parties. Those critical third parties, quite a lot of the time, will be technology companies. That will drive technology companies to start to think more about their own supply chain and manage them in a more mature way. And we're increasingly seeing within organizations functions that both deal with, you know, outbound third-party management, but also inbound third-party management. So they learn, you know, from what people are asking of them as to how they then go and ask of their third parties. So I think we'll start to see better convergence amongst industries of course, many industries have for reasons of kind of provenance and product safety, had to really understand, you know, particularly in goods for resale, absolutely everything that was brought together to be in that, you know, in that product or service. I think we'll start to see that, excuse me, roll over into, you know, goods not for resale, which has typically been one of the areas where people haven't understood if you know, if a technology or a professional services organization has kind of sub-sourced out into places where visibility is more difficult. So I think we will, you know, we'll start to see people looking at both, you know, their third parties and their customers in a similar way, and get used to being, you know, asked similar questions and needing similar approaches to diligence. In terms of collaboration, you know, as a leading utility, we would say that collaboration is really important. I think the utility model where, you know, we will do diligence on behalf of 100 customers rather than just one organization, you know, that area is maturing. You know, and we've had, you know, 5 or 6 years really to start to develop that model and make it work. I think what we also see then is we, for example, get our customers together when there's an event. So Log4j was a good example. You know, Ukraine was another good example. And actually, when there's a significant event, quite often this creates a huge amount of work in the supply chain for people to be able to say, okay, I now need to go and ask all of my suppliers this one specific question that, of course, isn't in my diligence questionnaire, because I'd never heard of Log4j until it, you know, arrived one Monday morning. And we can organize for collaboration around management of that event, because everybody effectively goes and asks a very similar question. So that's one area where we think we can drive efficiency through collaboration, as well as you know, developing industry standards to make it simpler both for the vendor and for the third party themselves to be able to show that they're, you know, fit to supply their customers.
So there's quite a few different aspects there. Sorry, just to pull one out, going off menu here, because you mentioned a few quite key points, including, you know, Penny said about real-time data, getting ahead of having to make so many requests upon your suppliers, but also so what would the difference for that real-time look, that real-time insight give you in comparison to having to go to suppliers and ask specific questions? Is it reliable enough, or do you still have to do both aspects really?
Well, I think so. One of the things we've been working on, and we've worked also with Simon on, it's something I call like trigger event management, and it's linked to a point I was saying earlier on, that change, it's not just the only aspect that can drive failure of a third party, that can drive failure of controls, but we do see change events as being a lead indicator that something could fail. And so if we think about, and I finally figured out how to use the chat, and someone's sent something through around supply chain data feeds, and that is hugely overwhelming. And how do you make the data feeds meaningful, and you're able to use them as sort of a lead indicator that something could fail in supply chain? So let me give you a few examples around how we've been trying to pull this all together. We mentioned financial resilience. So again, how can a financial resilience feed, how can I utilize that so I need to more closely watch the third party? Is there a limitation on that? Well, yes, during the pandemic, we saw that cash was king, and the only thing we could realistically do was to phone up our suppliers and just check that they had viability and enough cash to keep the lights on. So again, a fantastic resource, but will have its limitations. Again, Simon mentioned ultimate beneficial ownership. I've never seen so many third parties, high transactions, private equity. There is so much cash in that industry right now, and a lot of the tech solutions being utilized here are changing hands every 3 to 5 years. How how do you track that? Again, lots of good cyber feeds can come into your organization, which again give you an indication that something might fail. KY3P I know has a lot of like negative news scanning, for example, but these need to be anchored, to have tolerances, thresholds. They need to be linked back to risk appetite. Otherwise, you're just going to get overwhelmed with data. You're going to get a lot of false positives, which is just meaningless. And it's almost worse that you've turned these data feeds on than you didn't turn them on, because then someone's like, well, that got highlighted to you. It was, you know, point number 366 of a report. How come you didn't action it? But what it does mean if it's used successfully. So when I sometimes have to be, I go in and I sort of do a diagnostic around why there was an incident. One of the first things I will ask procurement and third party risk is, tell me how many due diligence assessments were done out of 6-4 cycle. And the reason why I'm asking that question is to understand whether or not I think the organization uses the data it has on third parties effectively. And very often the answer is no, we haven't done any out of cycle, even though I can look at these lead indicators and say, well, your financial due diligence data said that there was a fall in due diligence. I can see there's been a change in ultimate beneficial ownership. I can see from the business, the service performance has in actual fact dropped. There was indicators that meant something could happen. Equally, on the flip side, you could argue, well, if there's no change in the organization and we're still happy with the service performance, it's inside appetite. Do we need to assess them on as frequent basis as we're currently doing? Or if I'm happy that my trigger event management and my change management is working effectively, can I take a risk-based approach to say I'm going to assess them on a less frequent basis? Right. Potentially, but it's got to be meaningful data. It's got to be anchored against something. And that's where people often fall down. You know, I sit there and go, so what? You've got 25% of your business processes in India. So what? Is that okay? Is that not okay? Can you approve this next arrangement? What does that mean to you? You know, is that in, is that outside? So data is amazing, but it's got to become meaningful and it's got to be anchored. Hopefully that answered your question. Probably a little long-winded and answered multiple points, but you know.
I think that's a really good point, because so many conversations are still around drawing in data, and you know, once you've got that in, and then you still have to interpret it and make it, like you said, make it meaningful. And I think that's a really, really crucial step. Especially if you don't, you know, if you're dealing with a lot of third-party suppliers, like you said. Actually, that does bring us quite very neatly onto the next point, talking about the usefulness of data and how that can drive more predictive and proactive work. So, Simon, can you expand on that a little bit about, you know, getting more meaning and getting more activity out of data insights?
Yes, so we see, you know, pretty much every day there's a new interesting data feed emerging, whether it's you know, the latest iteration of something like cyber, where there are a number of different data providers, some of which are what we would call outside in, some actually engage with the organization themselves and help them improve. So innovation, you know, and the opportunity, you know, with software as a service and cloud-based technology to distribute data quickly is one of the key drivers. I think the next thing for us is to not think about going and doing, you know, a deep dive on-site review of a vendor where you get lots of, you know, where you produce a report, but to think of that as a data set as well, and to kind of break that down into its parts, and then use that data alongside some of the stuff that you can monitor every day. So sort of breaking down the barrier between having real-time monitoring at a relatively superficial level and kind of periodic monitoring at a very detailed level. So sort of connecting those two and building out the data sources, building them into a set of reporting, and like we've talked about, which is, what does that dashboard look like to tell you what are the meaningful changes in the feeds that you're getting, and then what other data do you collect, even if you don't think about it as data, from your interactions with those suppliers, either kind of planned or unplanned. And the final part from me on that point, really around, you know, why data is becoming more important in this space, is coverage is improving. So, you know, there are 30 million companies in North America alone. There are 75% more large companies than there were 20 years ago. So, you know, entities, private and public entity, the sheer number of organizations is increasing rapidly, when you might have thought it might be more stable over time. So it means that when we look at an organization, yes, there are a number of vendors who lots of people use, the household names, but actually what we find when you dig into that supply chain is actually quite quickly you get into you know, into local organizations that deliver services into corporates that actually you know, are somewhat niche and therefore need to be mapped, need to be identified. And so for us, it's as much about the accuracy of the data feed, as Penny points out, about not getting false positives, but also expanding the coverage, so that if you need to know about an organization, it's available and it's curated, and it's meaningful to you.
Thank you. I just had another question, but I wanted to just remind the audience. I know some questions are coming through on chat, but if you have any you'd like us to get to before the end, please send them on the Q&A note, so just in case, make sure they don't get missed. But so, sorry, back to you, Simon. Apologies. But so, did you have any specific examples of that, of using data to drive risk management, or and Penny as well? I mean, I know you mentioned a couple already, but if you have any others, please do share.
Yeah, I've got a couple of recent ones. You know, one of our clients, there was a cyber breach. We get into a conversation around, you know, how quickly can we tell our board that one of our vendors has had a cyber, you know. Well, the unfortunate reality is news travels pretty fast, right? So we'd love to be in a situation where we can tell you before anybody else knows, but that's not the reality. So, but what we were able to tell them very quickly.
Well, I'm not sure if we maybe have a little technical issue here.
I think we...
Yeah, were you able to pick that up?
Yeah, no problem, no problem.
Sure.
So I imagine what Simon was saying, what they were able to tell them very quickly. I'm just going to guess what he built upon, but when you've got good I'll just continue. I think just to build upon a point I said about operational resilience, is that when you've mapped in your third parties through to important services or through to the production of your product, when you do have a third party that has an instance, for example, cyber, is that through your pane of glass, you can very quickly see how you've been impacted by that third party. And Simon is back. We were just demonstrating in real life a sort of resilience. If you just lay just there,
yes.
Simon.
Yes, obviously my backup was well tested. So yeah, so you know, there's a cyber attack. Quickly knowing, you know, if you use that vendor, what you use them for, whether or not, you know, and that's sort of information that boards require. We're never going to be ahead of time, but the speed of response. And another example would be, you know, Financial One. You know, there was quite a big data center data center provider that a lot of organizations used that went into administration, you know, earlier this year. You know, we were able with our clients to be able to see that, you know, their financial scores were declining, to give them time to be able to look at additional services, because it's still the case for some services that it's just too expensive to have kind of like a warm standby, right? So, you know, that would be another one. And then the last one I guess we've talked about a bit was things like exposure to Ukraine and Russia and the supply chain. You know, we hear more and more people saying, because we had the data, we could answer the question from the board, and you know, in the day that we were asked, rather than having to go away and work it out for a couple of weeks. So those sort of examples, I think, are ones that come to mind.
Absolutely, thank you. And sorry, Penny, did you want to add any? I know, sorry, you helped out there.
No, I think Simon gave her answer. Thank
you so much. And so just to bring up one of the points that has come up in the chat from Chris, it says, I see, it's not a question, but I think it raises a good question. So he says, many organizations still use legacy systems, and with modern systems, they might have spreadsheets, and they're making assumptions based on things like supply chain costs, in scenario modeling. What are your thoughts on the amount of organizations that actually still rely on these types of legacy systems? And obviously, I know not every organization is going to invest in this field, but you know, what's the comparison? I guess what's the reality of not doing that?
Well, I mean, I think Chris raises an excellent point, and I think it's very commonplace, and there's a number of reasons why it is. You know, procurement, I'm talking to a bunch of experts, has often been very federated. They might have their own contracts, data place. You know, acquisition just within firms has been significant, and there's been no rationalization of third parties, no consolidation. So that data is very federated within an organization. I would say, and I'm sure Simon is the same, we probably get demos from new technology firms once every 3 weeks, once every 4 weeks, you know, promising to be that window pane into an organization. And some of them talk about, you know, plug and play, and I sit there and go, lies, because in order for this fantastic tooling, many of it, you know, coming from a great place, completely right, there's a hell of a lot of work that has to be done within an organization to get some of these tools to be able to work effectively. You know, I spend a lot of time nowadays talking about data governance within an organization when it comes to third parties. Who owns the contracts, who owns the subsequent data fields, who's got the golden source of truth. And exactly to Chris's point, when you've got good data going in, are those tools going to be effective? And I regularly say to people, don't you dare turn that on. You know, otherwise you're going to get, again, loads of false positives, and you're not ready to deal with the subsequent impact, you know, of that. So again, do I think what Chris has got there has got to be improved? Yes, you're going into the most uncertain market. And I think there's another question on volatility in the market. That's not going on away. So the pressure on the scenario, to test, to stress test, will only increase, and you can only do that with good data. So again, we do a lot of support to people who are just trying to get funding, you know, just to improve their technology, just to improve their tools, just to spend time on data governance, on ownership, on accountabilities, on responsibilities. I just think it's crucial. Procurement is a fundamental pillar of any organization, as is third-party risk management. So you've got to get the right data governance tool in technology to successfully achieve that. So Chris, if you need support, if that is your organization, or if you know one, then by all means we can help with that business case.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few in a similar vein there, definitely. But there's a couple of specific questions I want to jump to just before we stop there. So the quantity, I think you mentioned this already, you know, the quantity and diversity of data to properly follow SC risk is staggering, as you mentioned. How can one collect it and actually make sense of it? I know we already touched on this, but is there a sort of one golden rule or tip you could give for where to start on actually making sense of it?
I mean, I would always start, like, why are you collecting it and what outcome are you trying to drive from that data? How does that help you? and what is it anchored against? So when you get presented with the latest ESG is another fantastic example. I get a new ESG data feed once every 2 weeks at the moment, but it's really hard to see the wood through the trees and how that supports me. So what's the outcome I'm trying to deliver from that data? What is it anchored against? And what does it tell me against my risk appetite, my thresholds, and the tolerances? And just remember, there's readiness here. If someone's procuring a license and they're about to turn something on, are you ready to deal with what that data feed tells you? Or are you going to get hit by a lot of false positives and you've created an industry? So data is awesome. I love it. But readiness, anchor, framework, ownership, just so important.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to add to that, Simon, or shall we jump to the next question?
I'd say that one of the other things we do with clients is look at it the other way around. So we'll take the vendor base and we'll say, okay, how do we build up the best picture we can of this vendor base? So whether it's 200 of your highest risk suppliers or 25,000 suppliers across the enterprise. And what we've started to do to combat some of these challenges around the accuracy or getting kind of overwhelmed with data is to build it from the ground up and to say, okay, for how many of these do we have a really good ESG score? Sustainable One is the S&P business that we use to produce ESG scores. So what coverage have we got there? Okay, what coverage do we have from a financial perspective? Okay, where do we? And so rather than sort of trying to consume all of these feeds and kind of curate it, because it can become, overwhelming, starting to build out that picture. We've got 20,000 completed question sets on our database. Okay, let's look at your suppliers and let's say, how many of these question sets have we got? And then people can start to see that you pull that picture together with real examples of vendors. So that's how we tackle it.
Okay, thank you. And
shall I pick up the one on exit plans?
Yeah, go for it. Sorry, because I know you mentioned it already, so I wasn't going to go with that one, but please do.
No, for those non-FS people, just in the financial services, if it's a material service, you've got to have an exit plan, which says how you will exit from that third party in a stress or non-stress environment. I agree. I think exit plans, if I think around what their true purpose was, it was really for firms to really think about what are my services and what would I do if I had to exit from that arrangement. And it'll be interesting as they start to actually be executed from. I'm not sure that the exit plan probably the document that will be followed if you have to exit out of that arrangement. I know me and Simon talk on that regularly, and we're interested to see what happens. The one thing I would say on exit plans is we've regularly been past an exit plan and said, Penny, the regulator or the organization isn't happy that it would take me 2 years to exit out of this third party. Can you make it go quicker? And this is where I can't say enough to procurement and TPRM experts. It is not your job to make that exit plan go quicker. It is the underlying business. So take technology, for example. If you have an outdated technology stack, it will always take you a long time to exit out of that arrangement that sits with the third party. What needs to change for that exit plan to go quicker? Well, your technology, your level of tech debt, your level of your technology landscape has got to be simplified in order for that exit plan to go quicker. So I completely agree with what you're saying on exit plans. One thing I saw the other day, which I thought was interesting from a cloud perspective, again, what tools can we utilize rather than an exit plan, which is a point in time, is again for your cloud environment. It's like a new tool where it had like a sort of, again, a window pane looking down under all your services and what cloud arrangements were supporting your applications and your services. So again, it's not a point in time, it's real-time monitoring to say, well, if Amazon went down, here's how my applications and here's how my services would be impacted by that, which is better than dusting off all your exit plans to see how you'd exit out of Amazon, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, but again, really curious. Please ping me if anyone is about to execute on an exit plan. You know, curious to see how that will work. But I think the benefit of exit plans was really focused around, who are my services? How long would it take me to substitute them? Are they portable? And what is the competitors to the current third party? It was that real discovery phase where I think they brought value. I'm less backing myself on the value they bring around, are they a plan that you will execute on if a third party had a stress event? But I'm open to be proved wrong. We just haven't got enough data on that at this point in time.
And that's quite an interesting quandary. There's quite an irony there of it's become potentially irrelevant by the time you've actually got around to using it.
You're supposed to keep them up to date, and you're supposed to test them, but in this volatile world, things change very quickly, which I think was the good point made there.
Yeah, sorry, in case anyone didn't see that question, or if you're watching back and you can't see the chat, it was about you can have the first rate exit plan today, but it could be out of date next week. So how do you cope with the volatility there? But thank you, that was a fantastic answer. That's a good point. And please do get in touch, anyone who can share some insight on that. And actually, that's probably a really good, neat place to wrap up. Thank you so much, both. There's a lot of information there. If I can ask you for one key takeaway for the audience today, each, if I start with you, Simon, if you've got one key point that you can have people take home with them.
I would just reiterate what I said a few moments ago. Build the profile of your vendors from the ground up, and take your time to do that, and use real examples to do it.
Thank you. And Penny?
I would just say, utilization of data is awesome, but it's got to be meaningful, and it's got to be anchored, and it's got to be able to tell you something more about your risk posture. Otherwise, it's just useless to you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, and absolutely, again, thank you again for sharing that. You've got some really juicy detail in there as well. Fantastic. But I'm afraid that is all the time we have for today for this session. Thank you so much for everyone who's joined live and for sharing your questions and your comments. Sorry that the chat function wasn't working earlier on, but hopefully we fixed that in the end. So this recording will be available to watch again soon. As I said, it will be on the CIPS YouTube channel. You can go there and have a look for it as soon as that's available. Have a look at some other ones. A huge thank you to Simon and Penny for taking part. And thank you as well to S&P Global for partnering with us on the CIPS seminar series. The next one is in just a couple of weeks, and you can that's about ESG, which came up a few times today. ESG in context of supply chain and risk management, and there's a link to that. You can register in the chat, or you can go to the website, the CIPS website, and look for that as well. And please do join us as well for that one. But in the meantime, thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.